Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. This is going to be episode 16. I'm recording this Saturday, January 18th. I'm here this morning with Alexander Mercouris, editorial director of the Duran. I think I've got that title right. And
Absolutely.
Absolutely all around one of the most talented geopolitical analysts in the world. I have learned so much from Alexander. If any of you think that I'm any good at this geopolitics stuff, he's one of the people that you have to thank for me becoming good at it. So I've spoken to Alexander once before on YouTube, on Crypto Rich's channel. You can look that up. And I thought that talk went really well. And I decided to follow it up because we've got a lot to talk about this morning about Russia. So good morning, Alexander. Thank you for doing this. And I hope you're well.
I am very well and delighted to be on your show, Tom. And can I just say, I think you're an outstanding geopolitical analyst. So, and I've also learned lots from you. So just to make that clear, we learn from each other and we get ideas from each other.
Absolutely. That's the way if we don't do stuff like this, and in some respects, I think that one of the things we haven't done as a community yet is really reach out to each other and form good, solid connections and whatnot in order to better give the people and curate for the people what's actually happening behind the headlines.
I agree.
And it's something that I think it's important that I now start taking a leadership role in that as well. So I feel more comfortable in doing so. So it's now time to do that. So let's get right to it. So. Wow. Woke up the other morning and I happened to be going over to TASS. I don't normally have TASS in my once a week or so I'll go over to TASS, but I happened to be there that morning looking for a particular thing. And I look up and I see Russian government resigns. What happened? I hadn't had a chance yet to even watch Putin's State of the Union address. I just read a couple of quick synopses of it. And I'm like, I was very confused. So I thought this is a perfect time for you and I to sit down and have a chat about that. So I know I wrote something about it. I don't know if you had a chance to read it or not, but
absolutely. Of course I have.
Okay. And so why don't you give me your thoughts on that and tell me if I'm off base or, crazy or, on point or whatever. Let's just start the conversation from there. So.
Right. First of all, you're not in any way off base, but I think there's 3 points I'd like to first of all start with. Firstly, this has been under discussion for some time in Russia. We need to understand this. One of the problems when talking about change in Russia is that the reason it often catches us a lot by surprise is because the media in the West doesn't cover Russia very well or indeed properly, and they are not interested essentially in these sort of changes because their focus is so narrow on Putin himself and what they think Putin is doing. In fact, if you'd followed the news over the last weeks just before the Christmas and New Year holiday, you would have noticed that Vladimir Putin was heavily involved in a whole series of meetings. And in fact, one particular week, his spokesman said that he'd only slept through that whole week for about 5 to 6 hours. Wow. That gives you an idea. So there was intense discussion, which was probably building on discussions that were going on over much of the year leading up to this event, which is, by the way, a huge event, and you're absolutely right to highlight how important it is. So we mustn't think that this has come completely out of the blue. The second thing is we must, I think, separate the very important constitutional and administrative changes, which we'll drill into, and which are significant in themselves, from the political changes, the personnel changes, which are actually in the immediate term even more important. Because I think one thing people need to remember is that though these constitutional changes are slated to come into force probably in May or June, the new government is in the process of being formed as we are talking now. And these personnel changes that we're talking about are already in process of being made, and they will remain in effect beyond the constitutional changes for the remainder of Putin's term. And here I completely endorse the points which you were making in your article, because these personnel changes, these governmental changes, what they tell me is that this long period of time, which last started in about 2012, when the Russians were undergoing this very tough fiscal and monetary policy. We are in agreement, by the way, about how self-defeating and misguided many aspects of that monetary policy were. Right. That long period is now coming to an end. And here I'm going to just quickly refer to an event which has received no attention at all, but it happened, I think, either in August or September. There was a meeting between Putin and the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, in which reported on the presidential website, and very unusually, the Russian presidential website, which is mandatory reading for anybody who really wants to get into the granular detail of Russian politics, it didn't actually provide any kind of transcript of their comments. It just said, they talked about various things, and it was clear to me that there had been some kind of a dressing down. And then what happened was, the following day, Putin met with the economic people, the economic ministers of the government, and Nabiullina wasn't there. Now that is really remarkable. That is huge. Nabiullina was excluded.
Yeah, no, I remember reading that stub, and I was like, okay, and there was nothing much there. I just noted afterwards that she started finally cutting interest rates, and I wrote about it back then and said, wow, okay, she's finally, but that's the second time that's happened in the last 3 years, because she was holding interest rates at 10% back in 2017 or 2016, I can't remember. The everything after 18 months becomes kind of blurry. And Putin showed up on a Wednesday. They sat and talked, and on Friday, Nabiullina cut interest rates by 50 basis points. And I just said, there you go. And it was absolutely necessary, because she was holding interest rates far too high, and it was curtailing the Russian economic recovery. And it was absolutely necessary for him to say, okay, that's enough. You don't work for the IMF, you work for us.
Exactly.
And that's that. So continue.
She didn't just slow down or abort the Russian economic recovery. She came very close this year in 2019 to killing it. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was all done because inflation was going to explode. And in fact, what happened was inflation fell far below her own target. Yep. And you're much more of an economist than I am. Yes. The fact that inflation has fallen so far and so fast is probably a sign of a decline in economic activity as compared to what it ought to have been if interest rate policy had been more rational. So he was clearly very angry. It's been interesting to see how he has been speaking over the last few occasions when he's been speaking, and he's been very, very careful not to speak as strongly in defense of the central bank as he has on other occasions. Yes. So I think we are now going to see a major shift in economic policy. We're going to see a much more rational monetary policy that we've had up till now, and I think we are going to see as a result, and as a result of various other things that are now on stream, a pickup in growth rates. And in fact, the economics ministry is predicting higher growth in 2021 and higher growth this year, but especially in 2021. And I think the new prime minister who has been brought in, who is a tax official, who has a very clear, granular understanding of what the economy is doing. He has his finger on the pulse of the economy, and we'll talk about the tax structure in Russia further on in the program. But he's also somebody who understands, I think, spending, and I think his job is basically, firstly, to understand how any, easing of monetary policy and a growth in investment policy is going to work, but at the same time to keep a control on spending, because Putin is very, very clear about the fact that Russia is not going to start going on a massive spending or borrowing spree of the kind that we see in all sorts of countries, including the United States and China and other places like that. So these are the things to highlight there.
Yeah, no, there's a couple of things to unpack there. You're absolutely right. I just wanted to throw some more detail on this. When you look at where the Russian economy was back in August, you're talking about real interest rates. That's nominal interest rates minus inflation. We're running 6.5%. She's still are running 4.5%, 5%, right? So we were looking around 7.75% on the targeted effectively federal funds rate, and inflation down around 3.5%. So Russia was literally running the best. They were the best investment in the world. And one of the things that Putin and Sergei Glazyev and all the kind of hawks, fiscal hawks, understand about, geopolitical hawks understand, is that too much foreign investment into the Russian market makes them vulnerable to hot money inflows, also become hot money outflows. Okay. And that's what they are very worried about. And so while they would like foreign investment to come in, and they want to be able to expand, because they're going to need to be able to expand the use of the ruble as a regional trade and reserve currency. And that's what they're setting up, right? With the Eurasian Economic Union and all of this stuff. And I really firmly believe that you can see the whole decoupling of the ruble from the dollar. And so, but it's important that doesn't become too hot. All right, we don't want too much money flowing into Russia too quickly. We want it to be an organic thing. I'm thinking when I say we, I'm thinking about it from Putin's point of view. And so his dressing down of Nabiullina, who was trying to, in effect, hold those rates high, curtail the expansion, any economic expansion, and then use that would be used as an excuse for Moody's and to come in and kill their rating, and then their investment rating, and then all the money flow out, and they put pressure on, try and do what we normally do, which is economic warfare through that kind of thing. We put more sanctions on the United States and all of that stuff. So doing that, but cutting interest rates quickly from 7.75% to 6.5% or 6.25% now, it puts them in a very good position, because now it also, and it's important from a domestic borrowing perspective. They want to see domestic borrowing start to take off, and domestic borrowing in rubles as opposed to dollars. And if that interest rate differential is too high, then that also empowers all of the financial oligarchs that Putin's been fighting for the last really 5 or 6 years. So he's got all the other guys under control, but it was the financial sector he didn't have under control. And so this IMF-inspired inflation targeting monetary policy, which is, by the way, patent nonsense, it had to go. And he understands that well enough. And so does, I think, Mishustin, of course, understands that as well, who's the new prime minister under Russia. So there's an interesting dynamic there that no one else is talking about, and has to be, you have to kind of think of it in that way, is how can they fuel a domestic expansion, attract foreign capital of the right kind, and sustain a higher growth rate, which will then allow for real wage growth in Russia, which has been spotty, and it's just starting to take off. I think the last print was 3.5%. So that's a good sign, because now that's above the official rate of inflation, which is excellent. It rarely happens in Russia. It's been a problem. So we have real wage growth is positive. You've got real interest rates are positive, but not too positive. And now you've got a falling interest rate differential, because the Fed's going to have to raise rates, Alexander. This is the part that nobody wants to talk about. The short-term funding markets and the repo crisis is telling everybody that the Fed needs to reverse what the rate cuts and go back to 2.5%. So if you normalize that differential, and rate rises are going to be coming in Europe as well, and you normalize that rate differential, that will spur domestic borrowing in the domestic currency, and that will make the ruble even more attractive as both an investment currency and as a currency to recycle trade surpluses in. And and they have to reverse this dynamic of running too high a trade surplus, because the Russians are just making money hand over fist right now. So
absolutely. Now, can I just
Sure.
illustrate some of the points you're making? And when you talk about, for the Russians, for Putin and various officials within the Russian government being very nervous about capital inflows, hot money, they actually lived through the crisis of 2008, 2009. I was following Russia very closely at that time. And what had happened was that over the 2 years leading up to that crisis, Russia actually did become a major destination for hot money. There was a short period of time when capital inflow was exceeding capital outflow. And I can remember all sorts of people, foolish people, reckless people, I know some of them still, saying, this is a good thing, it shows that the economy is about to take off. What then happened in 2008 was that all that hot money suddenly left Russia. All kinds of loans that had been given by Western banks to Russian companies were pulled. I know one particular Russian company whose treasurer is a friend of mine at that time, who said to me that he just completed negotiations for a loan with a certain Western bank, and the bank simply reneged on the loan. They didn't actually see through with it.
Right.
And the economy came incredibly close to total collapse. This is something that people don't actually know. The Russian stock market imploded. Capital reserves, the government's own reserves, were nearly exhausted. It was, for Putin and for all the people around him, an absolute and profound shock. In the event the line just held, and Barack Obama, of course, came along and he started, with massive fiscal reflation, and the Fed started with its QE programs, and that stabilized the system a little. But after that, Putin and the people around him said, never again.
Yep.
We're never going to have that situation ever happen again. And it's been very interesting. You were talking about how Russia became an attractive investment destination. There's again been a series of meetings within the Kremlin, one very recently with Kirill Dmitriev, who is the person who's in charge of the direct investment into Russia. And you can see that they were all saying exactly the same things that you've been saying now. They've been saying, we don't want hot money, we want proper direct investment by people, working in, doing the kind of things you do, but coming organically as our own economy develops. And this has been the major debate that's been going on within Russia over the last few years, between those people who want to completely integrate Russia into the Western economic system and those who say, no, it is incredibly dangerous to do that. We saw what happened in 2008. We've seen the sanctions wars that have been fought against us since. We can't allow that to be, we can't expose ourselves to that kind of crisis again.
No, and if you really think about it, the sanctions regime has actually strengthened Putin's hand in all of this, because they don't have access to dollars like they used to. They just simply can't get them now. And and necessity, I like to say that necessity is the mother of invention, right? Or necessity. It's more than it is. It's this necessity of, oh well, I've been deprived of this particular tool. I have to use something else, right? And that's what I'm seeing in the way the Russians, in ways Putin has used the quote unquote sanctions and the crisis that they've created as an opportunity to implement the very policies that he wants. He wants implemented, and so it's very obvious to me that this has been, he's welcomed this, and every time the United States puts more sanctions on him, he just goes, well, thank you very much for strengthening my hand, because this continues to depower the Western, the Western, what the Saker calls the Atlanticist fifth column, and again, they're mostly now in the financial sphere from my understanding of this. And again, my understanding of this is kind of superficial, to be honest with you. I understand global capital flow, and so that helps inform all this, but I mean, I don't know the players involved, and I don't know, the granular details of this, but it's pretty obvious to me what Putin is trying to do, because this is exactly what I would do if I were him. Right?
Well,
right? So
What can I give you again? A personal example. I attended an economic conference in St. Petersburg, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, and I went to a meeting of one of the group sessions with all sorts of Russian bankers there. And I remember being absolutely stunned by how aggressively pro-American some of the people within the Russian banking world were.
yeah.
I mean, it was actually shocking.
Right.
But I would say also, and this is the indication of things that were to come, there were other Russian bankers there who were pushing back.
Yeah.
I mean, so you could I actually saw this within the financial community being playing itself out.
Right.
And one of the interesting things is I forget his name, but he had an I forget I'm not going to try and remember his name, but I mean his particular bank, this one of the most aggressive and outspoken there's a pro-American bankers there. His bank has gone, it failed. So there we go.
And so the person for me, I think I use as the bellwether for a lot of what's going on is Herman Gref, the CEO of Sberbank, which is the biggest bank in Russia. And because knowing one, I don't know, and this is probably something I should have looked into is more of Gref's background, but I use him as a bellwether to see what's happening here. If he's on board or at least silent about what's happening, then that's usually a good sign, because this is going to be the bank that's going to have the most influence ultimately as to what can or cannot shape up and shake out. So it just seems clear to me at this point that Putin's got complete control over the Kremlin for the first time in his entire career.
I agree. I agree. I mean, it's been coming. I mean, Putin always works. I think this is an important thing to say about this. He always builds a consensus.
Yes, he does.
Within the political elite before he acts. That's what makes his plays seem so strong, because discussion is carried out very privately. And I mean, it's remarkable how little this government actually leaks. It
is really.
It really is. But when the decision is made, it has all the major people behind it.
Yep.
So the result is it comes over as an extremely strong play and very impressive, and often, of course, a great surprise to many people who didn't see it coming. Though, as I said, if you sort of do the dreary business of plowing through all the various meetings that Putin has, which you can find on his website, you could actually sense in the run up to the new year that something big was coming.
Something big was coming. That's a good way of putting it. So it's interesting speaking, and then speaking of that, I was just trolling tasks this morning before you and I got on this call, and I saw something here that just pinged right out at me. So Rosneft apparently just bought a larger stake in a major German refinery, Bayern refinery, and I'm looking at this going, it's not a big deal. It's not going to make huge headlines. It's only 2.5% increasing their stake from 25% to 27%, but it's indicative of to me, it's like a big, it's a big two fingers up to the Americans from the Russians and the Germans saying, look, you're not going to stop our relationship in energy. It's just not happening. No matter how many sanctions you put on our companies, no matter how much you bloviate and bluster, no matter how many bad things you blackmail us into doing, instituting the dispute mechanism under the JCPOA, which was obviously done under massive duress. By Germany, France, and not the UK, but certainly Germany and France. This isn't, again, just another one of those moments where you can just see how no matter how much the United States attempts to punish anybody for doing what is actually in their best interest, that's only just it's only just making everybody that much angrier, and eventually it's going to be. Once the United States is no longer in a position with this massive synthetic short against the dollar because of all the dollar-denominated debt from a decade or more of low interest rates, where borrowing in dollars was cheap, then once that's done, and once that debt has been worked off and redenominated or redenominated, sold, defaulted on, or whatever, that synthetic short falls tremendously. And on the downside of that, that's when the dollar's quote unquote day of reckoning finally comes. And that's not going to be tomorrow or next week or next month, but you can see how that's going to play itself out over the course of the rest of Putin's term, because this is the time period we're talking about where all this is going to happen.
Exactly.
And so it's between now and 2024 where all the big stuff is going to happen, and everything else after that's going to just, in the words of Neil Stephenson, just going to be a chase scene after that. It's just going to be, we're just going to be on the downside of it, and you'll see it. So, so let's shift and talk a little bit granularly about the shift in the government and what's happening there. I'd like to get your thoughts on, in particular, something I don't know a lot about, which is the Council of Regions. And then because I understand, I think, what's happening with the Duma and what's happening with the Constitutional Court, their version of the Supreme Court, but the Council of Regions is a kind of murky area. I talked about it a little bit on my live stream last night, but I I feel like I'm out over my skis over that. So why don't you start there, and we'll see what comes up.
Okay, the Council of Regions, or the State Council, as it's sometimes also called, but these are interchangeable names.
Right.
This is a body that was created by Putin in 2000. Now, up to 2000, what you had was regional governors who were sort of people who were elected by the regions, except most of them were not elected. They were powerful regional oligarchs who were able to control elections, and they were almost barons in their regions. They had direct seats in the Federation Council, which was the upper house of the Russian parliament. Now, Putin, who very much wanted to centralize control, he took away their position in the upper house of the Russian parliament, the Federation Council. He reorganized that to make it much more like the German Bundesrat. So it is actually a place where regional representatives and the local councils sit, rather than these powerful barons. And he created the so-called State Council, which was a purely consultative body, as the place where he basically decanted all of these powerful people. And they were left to wither there. And then, of course, what then happened was that in 2004, he took away the right from them to be directly elected. They henceforth became appointed. Now, after and he basically cleared them all out.
Right.
Then, in 2012, they were elected again, but he has retained the right as president to dismiss them. Right. But in effect, they still are people who are very much supervised and controlled by the central government in Moscow. And above the regional governors, he also created what are known as big federal districts, where there are appointed officials who keep an eye on what regional governments do at that level, the level of the so-called federal district. This is the so-called vertical of power that you sometimes hear about. And it was basically intended to end this system of these powerful local barons, many of them very corrupt, many of them very violent, who had basically usurped power in the regions. And it was his way of restoring, essentially, government across the country. Now, what has happened is that over time, the State Council has become a more sophisticated body. He's been adding various people, experts and people of that kind, to it. And it now has quite an important role in carrying out research for the government, looking at what's going on in particular regions. It's become a kind of transmission belt between the central government and the regions, because the governors still sit there, and it works that way. And it's also very helpful in developing legislation. So what Putin wants to do is he's going to give the parliament, the Duma, much more power in appointing the government. He's also sees the Duma, obviously the Duma will remain the main legislative instrument. So he's now going to balance the increase in power of the Duma by creating these two, by strengthening these two other bodies. Firstly, the State Council, which is where, as I said, the regional governors are. That is now going to become, it seems, the place where a lot of legislation is first debated and discussed and ironed out. And the regional governors and the people who sit there, the experts, will be able to look at it, and they'll be able to package the laws. The laws will then go to the Duma. The Duma will then vote on the laws. Before the president then signs the laws, he will then send them to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court will tell him whether or not these laws correspond with the Constitution, and then, of course, the president will sign them. So it's a system, if you like, of checks and balances. It involves the regions in the process of legislation. Mm-hmm. At the same time, it provides some kind of a check on the Duma, so they don't come up with wild and crazy laws out of nothing, because they're going to be a more powerful institution. But it leaves the president in overall charge, because he picks ultimately who is in the State Council, and of course he also has the Constitutional Court, which will be there to make sure that the laws that are passed are actually correspond with the Constitution. It is a system which actually has some precedence in pre-revolutionary Russian history. There was a very similar State Council in pre-revolutionary Russia, which did something of the same role as the new State Council, as the existing State Council will do. And there was a body called the Governing Senate, which fulfilled many of the same functions as the Constitutional Court. And rather interestingly, the building which houses the Constitutional Court is the same building that used to house the Governing Senate. So it's
nice.
I think
some nice symbol. There's some very interesting symbolism there.
There's very interesting symbolism, and bear in mind, Putin is a man who takes history very seriously.
Yes, he does.
Very historically informed person.
Right.
So this is. I don't think this is a coincidence. No. But you can also see how all of these structures are supposed to balance each other. He's taken one other important step, by the way, to keep things, to sort of balance things out, which has not attracted as much attention as perhaps it should. But the procurators, the Russia's equivalent of district attorneys, have up to now been appointed by regional officials in consultation with the central government. Henceforth, the central government will appoint the regional officials. In other words, the president will appoint these procurators, the district attorneys, in consultation with the upper house of the Russian parliament. Now, that effectively means, again, greater centralization of law enforcement, but at the same time involving the regions through the State Council in the process of drafting legislation. It's a fairly complex system.
Yes, it is.
I think, an unduly complex one, and it leaves the position of the presidency pivotal at the center.
Yeah, and which was Putin's main point he made in his speech, which was that he feels very strongly that Russia, not necessarily everyone, but Russia is best governed with a strong central leader that has a proper organizational structure underneath him, which is what this point that he was making, and that other people may work better, but other systems may work better. But there's two other interesting points, which is that one, he absolutely does not want Russia to devolve into the kind of parliamentary chaos that we have in Western European style parliaments, where there's factionalization and these grand coalitions that have ultimate power to appoint governments, like and the chaos that you see there, because he's made this point that he doesn't feel like democracy as an institution in Russia is strong enoughly embedded for it to be the primary means by which the government operates. He's effectively made that point in the past, and it's a very young thing, and it's something that itself needs to be checked and balanced. Moreover, I don't think the Russian people actually want that.
Indeed, I mean again, there was a Russian political scientist, philosopher of the late Tsarist era and of the Soviet era who was lived in emigration, and he basically said that the system in Russia, that the Russian society is so immature politically that you have to have a period of time when democratic institutions such as parliaments operate within a very, very strong overarching system of controls in order that they can develop and mature to the point where they can govern unaided. And Putin has spoken favorably about Ilyin many times. And again, one doesn't know to what extent he's actually familiar with Ilyin, how much time he has to read him. But again, I would be surprised if some of this thinking isn't present in some of what Putin says. You're absolutely right, by the way. He does not want to see the kind of chaos that you see in so many countries in Europe, and he absolutely has the support of most Russians in that. I mean, it's a very difficult thing for people to understand, but Russians, even young Russians who didn't live through it, still are haunted by the spectre of the 1990s and the chaos that went on there, and they emphatically do not want to return to that kind of situation.
And I think Putin is absolutely worried about any kind of potential for Western influences to make untoward inroads. And this is part of the reason why he's devolving some of the power of the presidency down to the Duma and to the Constitutional Court and to the Council of Regions, the State Council. He's devolving some of that power in order, because he understands, I think, that whoever comes behind him can't wield the kind of power that he's wielded. That he's needed to wield that power in order to get control over the country and to rescue it from the abyss. And now he's slowly but surely trying to pass that power off and democratize that power, because he knows that his time is ending. Yes. And it makes sense to me what he's doing here. And of course it's what do you call, reported in the West that he's trying to take over the world and all this other. It's such rotten Bill Browder nonsense. I just want to reach through my Twitter feed and strangle somebody, but unfortunately that whole non-aggression principle thing keeps getting in the way. So,
well, I read the title of the article in The Economist is that Putin is going to rule Russia forever. So he's presumably found the elixir of immortality. I mean, it's quite bizarre, actually, the kind of thing.
Sometimes I think that these people work for the Babylon Bee, Alexander. I mean, honestly, it's so cartoonish. I think it's satire. It's like, are you kidding?
Absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, you're perfectly right. He is preparing, and he's not, when I say he, I mean, lots of people have been.
Sure.
This isn't just one person. It's not been plucked out of the air by Putin. But no future leader reasonably is going to be prepared to work non-stop for a whole week on just 5 or 6 hours sleep. I mean, Putin knows that. It simply isn't going to happen. Right. Nor is any leader, realistically, any leader that replaces him, going to have the kind of authority, the kind of personal authority that Putin has accumulated through his successful mastering of crises. Because hopefully there aren't going to be those kind of crises again.
Exactly.
I mean, that's partly the point. So he has.
No, absolutely.
He has to create a system which, as some Russians say, is less manual. It relies less on the person at the top to pull all the levers all the time. Right. And that's what he's trying to do. So he's trying to build up these three institutions, the State Council, or the Council of the Regions, as it's also called, the Constitutional Court, and the Duma, and at the same time leaving the presidency in a very strong position, but also clearly delineating that there are roles for the prime minister in running civilian economy, yes, and that there are roles for the president also, but with the president ultimately in charge. So it's perhaps less a system of checks and balances in the American style, which I think he would also say isn't really something that's suitable for Russia, but
absolutely.
But a system, as I said, which is balanced and which will, to the extent that any human creation can, provide a reasonably good system of governance for a country as vast and as complex as Russia's.
Oh, absolutely. Russia's it's unbelievable how much harder it would. From my perspective, it's so much harder to govern, given just the sheer differences in culture. I mean, I make the point all the time. I think the United States is too big to govern under one central government. What do I have in Florida, in common with people in Idaho, other than a common language and a common currency? Not much. And I mean, they say that the people in Idaho aren't fine people. Presumably they are. It's just that now if you take that, but we're all still downstream of Western European, our Western European roots here. Whereas in Russia, you're looking at everything across Siberia. There's just two different Russian federations, federal republics that are governed under Islamic law, Dagestan and Chechnya, and that has to be dealt with, right? I mean, this is not, and has to be respected, and all of this. I mean, just that alone, I remind people of that all the time. I'm like, just that alone vastly complicates the ability of the central government to even function. And as a centralized thing. So it's a system that has to be both, it has to be, I think, the way he's trying to set it up. To be honest with you, the more I study Russia, the more it makes sense to me. As opposed to the United States system, which, you'd argue that we have all these checks and balances, and yet somehow they don't seem to work, right? Because, well, democratic republics always do what they're doing right. What we're seeing in the United States right now. And for years, Congress abdicated its responsibilities to the president to allow it to have too much power. The Supreme Court has always arrogated too much power to itself. We don't have in practice, we do not have proper checks and balances. And this is all stuff that the anti-federalists argued against back at the during the constitutional crisis of the Second Constitutional Convention, back in the 18th century. So, I mean, we're dealing with all of this stuff today, and we're going to be dealing with it again. And I can tell you that it's not going to, if Washington doesn't change, then someone's going to change, someone or something is going to change Washington, or it's just going to start ignoring Washington. I think we're much closer to that in the United States than people want to truly admit. And I can see that, and Putin doesn't, absolutely, after having done all this work to get Russia back from the abyss, the last thing it wants to do is hand control of that to some frankly, some CIA stooge who then turns around and destroys the country again. For Wall Street. I mean, that to me is the big overriding factor here, and it's just so very obvious. So
and indeed, and he has taken he has proposed certain clearly sovereigntist suggestions, which are intended to do that. I mean, he's now going to the Constitution, the Russian Constitution. It's now going to be made absolutely clear that it is in fact superior to foreign law. Now, the law that he really has in mind, of course, is the European Court of Human Rights, which has been making all kinds of decisions which the Russians are extremely unhappy about on all kinds of topics and subjects, and which has frankly become increasingly politicized and hostile to Russia. So the Russians don't want to be put in a situation where they feel they have to, because their constitution mandates them to carry out the European Court of Human Rights' orders. That provision, by the way, exists in the Russian constitution as it stands now. The Russian constitution actually says that Russia is bound by decisions of international courts like that of the European Court of Human Rights. The reason is, it's insane. It was one of those extraordinary, bizarre things that was drafted into the Constitution in 1993 during the political crisis that took place that year by the ultra-liberal faction that had gained power in Russia at that time, and which saw its entire objective as making Russia completely subservient to the West. So that revision is in the Constitution, and it's now going to be taken out.
Yes.
And he's also made this other a provision, which is that a future president, and in fact not just president, but all the major office holders have to have had both citizenship and residency, Russian citizenship and residency, and not have any other citizenship apart from Russian, and have residency for at least 25 years.
Yep.
Now that automatically excludes all the sort of all these terrible people who have gone to the West and who have been agitating against Putin and the Russian government from there. So that is again a major sovereigntist step, and may I add, a very popular one. People will like it.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I've been operating under the principle for years that the United States wrote the Russian Constitution in order to be able to have easy points of failure or corruption. I always look at this stuff very strategically, very tactically. That I spend most of my free time playing very hard strategically difficult games, right? And I just look at this stuff and I always say to myself, okay, so where's the failure point? Where's the break point? You do, good deliberate, just do root cause analysis and where's my vector of corruption? And I'm sorry, but it's very obvious to me that a strong unitary executive like the Russian president and has, that to me just screams single point of failure. Right. And then you take that and then you layer in all these other smaller points, like being bound by international courts and all this other stuff. You're like, who wrote this? Because it certainly wasn't a Russian.
No.
And that's the thing. And I know that has been a point of contention in the Russian political dialogue for a long time. And so, of course, Putin's making he's doing all of this thing. And it just looks to me like these are all the right moves to secure to secure the people's support of all of this.
Yeah.
And set everything else at the same time.
You're absolutely right. And it's also very classic Putin, because Putin acknowledged in his speech that there'd actually been many proposals to get rid of this awful constitution entirely. But he is somebody who is extremely averse to doing major radical transformations of that kind, which could create volatility. So what he has done, and he's done it systematically ever since he became president, is that he has amended it into something completely different. So he does that. As I said, he did all these changes that we talked about earlier in our program, where he took the regional governors out of the Federation Council and decanted them into what was at that time this nominal body, the State Council. Right. He then turned them from being elected to being appointed officials. He's then created he sort of beefed up the Constitutional Court. This is very much his style.
Right.
He takes something and gradually, incrementally, he changes it into something completely different. You picked this exactly correct word when you described his conception of Russia's future economic growth as being organic. And it's the same thing with his process of state construction and constitutional change. It's organic. It looks at what is working, what isn't working, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense out of the present arrangements, and then it adjusts them and builds on them to adapt it ever more closely to the shape of what he thinks is Russia needs at this particular time in its history. So it's very classic Putin. And can I repeat again, when we talk about Putin, we're not talking about one individual. We're talking about a group of people. You mentioned Sergei Glaziev. I'm sure he's consulted about all of this. I'm sure, by the way, I'm pretty sure that Medvedev, the prime minister, would have been consulted. All of these people will have been talked to. The president of the Supreme Court, a man called Zorkin, who has many ideas on constitutional development. All of this will have been debated and discussed for a long time. And that's why we're now in a position to move forward towards something new.
It's interesting because I think Medvedev becomes an interesting figure here to support this, because I know that I know that he's not trusted by a lot of the Russian, I guess, diaspora commentariat. I guess those are putting those two words together. And not stumbling over them is kind of impressive in and of itself, right? No, I'm talking specifically about people like the Saker and Dmitry Orlov and others, right? And to me, Medvedev is a person who I think is in flux, right? I think at some point he realized that the West is not Russia's ally, and I think Putin finally has convinced him of that. And him dissolving the government so quickly the other day means that he's not fighting this. No. And at the same time, I also think that he's probably set up well by supporting this in the future, and he be in a position to actually lead once Putin leaves the scene. We'll see. I'm not making predictions here. It's just I'm trying to get a sense of this, because I do think Medvedev is a very important person in all of this. I also think that Putin isn't going to leave the scene completely either. I think he's going to insert himself into either the Council of Regions, the State Council, or whatever, and still have his hand in foreign policy, which is where he needs to be, post presidency. Guiding things and using that and all of that, the tremendous political capital in dealing with the real change. Because after 2024, as I talked about earlier, if we're talking about like the apex of what I think is going to be the financial and political crisis that engulfs the world, I think that happens right around the same time that Putin leaves power. That on the downside of that, Russia is going to be a very interesting position and there needs to be a strong hand with strong experience guiding foreign policy. It just means, it's the only thing that makes any sense to me.
Right. Well, I think we were actually even closer in thinking about this than perhaps you realise, because I wrote about a big article for the Duran, which I'll perhaps send to you, shortly after Putin got re-elected, and when he reappointed Medvedev, and you had all the people like Orlov and the Saker complaining about the Medvedev being re-elected and saying that he was the leader of the Atlantic integrationists.
Yes.
And I don't buy that argument at all. I think you are absolutely right. I think Medvedev was someone who, when he was president, thought that he could work with the US. He thought he could reach out to the liberals within Russia. He has always, however, fundamentally been a patriotic Russian. And I think he was absolutely shocked to find how he could not get on at all with Obama, and how he could not get on at all with the liberals within Russia itself. And if you actually track the kind of public statements that Medvedev has been making as prime minister, when he talks about foreign policy and about the sanctions policy of the United States, one of the most striking things about them is that they are actually much more hostile, openly hostile to the United States and to the West than Putin's own comments are.
Yes, that's true.
Something that people find very strange. Now, we haven't talked about this other very important body that exists within the Russian power structure, and which is not being mentioned directly in the constitutional changes, except in one very important way, and that is the Russian Security Council. Now, this is a body that never gets referred to at all in Western commentary. As far as most Westerners are concerned, it doesn't exist. In fact, the Security Council is the single most important institution under the president within the entire Russian executive system. It meets once a week, and it's chaired by Putin, and it's clear that it doesn't just deal with defense and foreign policy. It actually deals with every single aspect of Russian domestic, foreign and defense policy. It is Russia's actual and true cabinet. It is chaired by the president. The prime minister is an ex officio member, and the finance minister is also a member, though he only attends when he's needed. But it is the single most important body, as I said, in the Russian power structure. It did exist under Yeltsin, but in an extremely nebulous and ephemeral form. Under Putin, it has been given very, very real reality. And I would add that when you actually look at the process of decision making in Russia, it's clear that it's the most important decision making body, and all the most powerful people are the people who are its members are Russia's most powerful people. Now, Medvedev has now been made deputy chairman of the Security Council.
Right.
This is a new appointment, and it's not, I think, a promotion, because obviously the prime minister is an important official, but it brings Medvedev to the center of Russian power. So Medvedev as prime minister, if you think about it physically, as prime minister, his office was in the Russian White House, which is actually a building in some distance away from central Moscow, which used to be the parliament building of the Russian Federation. But it's some distance away. His new office is going to be in the Kremlin itself. Now, that in itself tells you that he's not just been kicked upstairs. I mean, I read somewhere that John Helmer, I think it was, said that it's like giving him a gold-plated watch. This isn't true at all. It completely misunderstands the importance of this appointment. Now, it's possible that as deputy chairman of the Security Council, where he will be kept fully informed of every aspect of Russian policy, including foreign and defense policy, he is again being prepared for the presidency. I'm not making that prediction. It's just a possibility. But it is also a possibility, if Putin wants to retain a senior position in the power structure after he gives up the presidency in 2024, that the place he will go will be as deputy chairman of the Security Council, because he will still be there at the center of power, but obviously not as the president. Whereas if he goes to the State Council, as I said, that is primarily a consultative and advisory body, and it's difficult to see how he could continue to exercise political influence from the State Council, given the way it is currently constituted. So I think people, again, are not focusing on the really important institutions. None of this is predictions. I don't know what is being discussed there, but I'm simply flagging various points.
No, that's really good commentary. This is something I did not understand at all. So I really appreciate you taking the time to lay that out, because now it all makes much more sense to me where Putin's role is once he leaves the presidency. And I think one of my regular viewers on my live stream, and someone I talk to regularly, tried to make this point to me, and I misunderstood it. It's the Security Council where Putin can still maintain the kind of not control but influence that he needs to in a post Putin presidency. So that's interesting, and I think that you're probably right about this. It also, by removing Medvedev from the prime minister position, it also removes him politically for the next couple of years while this takes place, so that he can watch, learn, and influence while not being a potential political lightning rod. Exactly. I think it actually insulates him from the public for a while, because United Russia is, Gilbert Doctorow made the argument the other day that what Putin's doing with the way the Duma is going to appoint the cabinet, that it has to all pass the entire Duma, and if there's no dominant party in parliament or in the Duma, then it's going to have to be a kind of grand coalition government. Yeah, if you understand what I hate to use that phrase because but it's the best way of explaining that all parties will be represented within the cabinet going forward, as opposed to just one party wins the election, does what they want to do, and then appoints all of the ministers, and no one has any say about it. which is the way it works in Europe. Whereas in the new system in Russia, yeah, they could do that. Well, say United Russia gets 55% of the vote, they could do that, and then Putin could turn around and go, no to that guy, no to that guy, no to that guy, no to that guy, do it again.
Exactly correct. I mean, the point to understand about Russian politics is that if you actually look at the big parliamentary parties,
yeah.
I know that it sounds bizarre when one's talking about institutions like the Communist Party,
right.
But there's actually a fair amount of consensus in Russia about the kind of directions that the country ought to be going about. The Communist Party in Russia is not the party, a communist party such as Lenin and Stalin might once have imagined. I think that is an important thing to say. And there are some very, very, very talented and clever people in the Russian Communist Party, including some who are, by the way, have been very successful businessmen and entrepreneurs. So it's not a party that you can completely dismiss, and the same applies to the other two major parties also. So I think what Gilbert Doctorow is suggesting, that we might start to see members of the government being drawn from other parties, is entirely possible, and it would also strengthen the overall stability of the political system, which is something, of course, which Putin cares very much about. The danger of that, of course, is that you get the perception in the country that the entire system is actually the government. And then if people become dissatisfied, they look for a more wild and dangerous opposition, and that might give a space for some rather alarming people. But I have to say, I think that is extremely unlikely. Now, one other point about Medvedev, which is, of course, that Medvedev has had to preside over this period that you were talking about previously, and which you've written about so extensively, of very tough fiscal policies, or very tough monetary policies, in fact, insanely tough monetary policies, and also a time when living standards took a big hit and have been stagnating. So obviously that's affected his popularity as Prime Minister. So getting him out of the scene for a time, putting him in an important position, will allow give time and space for his popularity to gradually rebuild. It's still surprisingly high, actually.
Yeah. I think the Russian people understood why all of these things were done, because Putin was very, and Medvedev as well. I think they were very skillful in how they communicated all this, because they said, look, we're gonna go our own way here, and that means it's going to be hard, and we're not happy about it, and our American partners are not making it easy on us, but well, guess what? That's what we have to do. And I think they were able to sell that pretty well to the Russian people. I think the rate, having to raise the VAT, as well as change the pension system, those were the big political issues that dented their popularity. But they were high enough that it didn't matter. And I think if there's a successful negotiation to the conflict in the Donbass, if there's a gradual removal of the European sanctions over Crimea, and that happens over the course of the next year, certainly while this is going on, I think that's going to do a lot to paper over a lot of the hardship, as well as I said earlier, real wages are rising. And if that continues, and oil, and this is a key point here that I've been making and no one else is making, and I can't believe that people don't understand this, is that Putin doesn't want $100 a barrel oil.
No.
He wants $50 a barrel oil. Because at $50 a barrel oil, now other aspects of the Russian economy are comparatively advantageous to the oil and gas sector. And that means spurring innovation. That means people looking, and entrepreneurs looking for new things to invest in, built on this very strong foundation of a profitable but not insanely profitable oil and gas industry, which only empowers the same oligarchs that Putin spent the last 20 years fighting.
You see,
it makes me, I don't understand why people don't. I mean, I guess I don't understand why people are because they don't understand Russia, and I guess that's part of the point. But that to me is the important part. That's another very important part. And the Germans absolutely want those sanctions. The German industrials certainly want those sanctions lifted. I'm sure so the French industrialists, if there were any left at this point, and the Italians and everybody else. I know, Hungary wants all these things, and it's just it's gonna come,
Yes.
and once it starts to happen, there's not much the Trump administration can do other than continue to try and squeeze blood from a stone. That's the way I read the geopolitical landscape. So
Tom, you're absolutely right that you're the only person who says that Putin doesn't want $100 oil. What I find really extraordinary about it is I actually remember Putin saying that.
Yes.
When there was $100 oil, I remember him actually saying exactly what you have said. He was in response to an interview. He said the great problem we have is that trying to persuade people to invest in, say, machine tools is very difficult when they can invest money instead in oil and gas and make much more. So it's very difficult to get people to start doing that sort of thing. And he said it. I remember reading it and, scratching.
He said it recently. Honestly, Alexander, he said it recently when oil prices fell. He was like, "This is all good. Yeah. We're fine. We're happy about this. This gives us the opportunity. It gives us the opportunity." This is when the ruble crisis. Remember this? When the ruble crisis started in 2015, the first thing he did was tick off Igor Sechin and Alexei Miller, the CEOs of Rosneft and Gazprom, saying you're no longer going to get the good loans at 4%. We're giving those to the agricultural sector. We're giving that to the machine tool sector. And they were like, like, no, you guys you're making plenty of money. You don't need state support. Go out and be better.
Exactly.
And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Let's put Gazprom in the portfolio because that's the only thing that makes any sense to me.
Well, exactly.
See it right there.
It's not just people don't understand Russia. They don't understand basic economics either. Now, I am not an economist.
I know.
But I can see it's not rocket science to understand these things.
I tell people this all the time, like basic economics. Well, the problem with basic economics is that we don't teach basic economics, Alexander. We teach this weird Samuelsonian thing that mixed with Larry Summers' negative interest rates thing that just doesn't make any damn sense. It's, at the end of the day, I tell people all the time, it's like they ask me, it's like, what economics book should I read? I'm like, well, you can start with Gene Callahan's Economics in One Lesson because it's a beautiful, like, layman's introduction to Austrian economics, and then just read Harry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson, which is a classic. And then you can lever up to there from there and start reading Mises and Rothbard and all the others. But this is just basic stuff about how primary goods become secondary goods become tertiary goods, and how you invest in them and why, and the cost of money, and how the cost of money, which is the interest rate, affects all levels of the structure of production. And it's not that difficult. And Putin, I know understands this stuff, and he governed. What's interesting about Putin, remember, radical libertarian here. I don't even believe government should exist at a philosophical level. But when I watch Putin operate, I look at him and I say, that's the way you expect a good government to run. If it's going to be a good government, let's have it run. If we have to have this evil of government, then it should operate like this. And he operates very close to what a paleo-conservative or not a narco-libertarian, but big L libertarian would actually govern by. Now, he's at times had to, and I'm talking about in the grand scheme of things, specific policies, sure. Has he put people in jail? Absolutely. Has he done horrible things in order to get Russia under control? Of course he has. Yes. And let's not whitewash this. This is about, we're talking at the geostrategic level for most of this stuff. But at a personal level, I don't know whether I'd want to meet Vladimir Putin or not. I don't care because it's not important. But it is important to understand that this is the kind of government that people around the world are hungering for.
Yes.
And he's just provided a blueprint to an awful lot of world leaders who are grappling with these very issues right now. And someone in my live stream last night brought up the point that Erdogan in Turkey, and you can speak on this because you probably know this better than I do, and that his consolidating power is he trying to do, in a sense, the same kind of thing that Putin's doing that's applicable to Turkey. I don't know Turkey well enough at a governmental level to make that assessment. But it seems that if you've got a weak presidency and you're trying to move to a stronger presidency because you need that kind of thing during a crisis period, you've got Xi being elected, basically, communist pope for life. You've got Putin as the unitary executive in Russia. Now, Turkey is moving towards a unitary executive system, already has that.
Yes.
Well, while that may not be ultimately stable in the long term, during a crisis period, it probably would be. And what we're seeing, obviously, in the United States is a devolving and a tearing down of the power of the presidency, and with good reason, because the president in the United States is too powerful. But at the same time, Congress is completely corrupt. So. So if you want to speak to that, I wouldn't.
Well, very, very briefly. I think Erdogan. One can argue that what Turkey needs is a strong executive presidency.
Right.
I'm not so convinced that Erdogan is the man.
Is the guy, right? No, I will absolutely agree with that.
I think that perhaps he wants to reproduce a lot of what Putin has done in Russia, and I'm sure there's no. If you follow the dynamics of the meetings of the two people, it's quite clear that Putin is very much the sort of dominant one, and that Erdogan is a bit intimidated by him.
Sure.
But he may want to reproduce something like what Putin has done in Russia. I don't think he fully understands what Putin has done in Russia. And if I'm going to say something, and you were talking about, the Russian people understanding what Putin and Medvedev and all these people have been doing, Russia is also a civilized, it's a sophisticated and well-educated society. People are very well informed.
Yes.
There are many problems, but people are well informed and they're quite disciplined. Now, Turkey.
It was funny that a Greek would call the Turks uncivilized. I was laughing. I was trying. It's really funny.
Yeah. I was thinking more about Russia because the way Russia is presented in the West is a sort of barbaric place.
Right.
It is not.
It's not.
It really isn't. It is actually a very, very orderly and functional place. Much more so than people understand. It's incredibly complex.
Yes.
It is unbelievably complex. As you rightly say, there are people in the Caucasus who do their own thing with Sharia law. There's all sorts of people in, far away in Vladivostok, they're doing their own thing. But there is this sense, there is a, shall we say, a tradition of governance. Right. Now, Turkey has, I think, some way to go before it is able to do that. And I think it will get there. I am going to say this. I've been to Turkey many times. Actually, I love the country, by the way. I do. But I went to Turkey in the 80s, and I've been. Turkey today has progressed immeasurably since then. It's a much more sophisticated and educated society than it was then. But I still think it has issues of governance, which I don't think that Russia has, which would make it more difficult for Erdogan, even if Erdogan had the kind of understanding of administration and economics that Putin does, to reproduce in Turkey the sort of system that Putin has in Russia. It's very important to re-emphasize the point that you made, which is that the Russians are not looking to export their model. This is a fundamental misunderstanding. Yeah. They're trying to find the best possible, or reasonably possible, system of government adapted to their current needs. It's a constant evolution. But no Russian leader is going to say what, say, Lenin or Stalin used to say, that, we found the optimal solution for everywhere and we want to impose it on everyone. The Russians have been through that. Yep. They've seen what an utter disaster it was. They've seen what a disaster it was for them also. Yes. And they will not want, and they would never come along to Erdogan and say, well, look, we've done this and it works incredibly well, so you must also do it in Turkey. That's absolutely not what they're about in any way. And I think they're right, and I think Turkey will have to, over time, find its own road. I'm sure it will. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure that Erdogan
is the guy.
Is the guy. That's all I'm
Oh
saying.
yeah, no, absolutely. That was my that was going to be my follow-up point, which I don't think that Erdogan is that man. But interesting what you said about exporting and I think this is the final point. I think we'll wind it up here because you and I can then do a separate podcast on like Europe, in a few weeks' time.
Absolutely.
Because I think it's going to be more relevant timing wise then. But your point about Russia not wanting to export anything and about the cost of effectively imperial attitude and the imposition of a particular system on everyone else, I think that's the lesson that the United States is going to have to go through, and that we're going to have to learn. And it's going to be painful for Americans to learn it. It's pretty clear that that's where we are in this part of the cycle, and it's our job to remind everybody as best we can the clear differences between what they're being told and what they feel and what they can see happening. And it's pretty clear that over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, we're going to get to a critical mass of people in the United States who fundamentally understand that in a way that isn't centered around a particular person. I think it's going to be a much more generalized critical mass. And I hope that it happens before we hit rock bottom. But to be honest with you, Alexander, I'm not sanguine about that analysis as best. And that's just the honest truth. And unfortunately, it's a lesson that, well, I think all societies that grow too big for their own britches have to learn. So I'm going to leave it there. And if you have any final thoughts, you're more than welcome to make them.
I'll just make one very quick observation, which is about the United States, which is that the Russians are so happy and so relieved that they don't have to carry the burden of exceptionalism anymore.
Yes.
I mean, if this idea that there's this huge hankering in Russia to return to this great superpower that the Soviet Union was, there isn't any. This is such a complete misunderstanding. Yeah. And I predict that if what you say happens in the United States, if it were to happen there, it would be exactly the same. I think Americans would find that they wouldn't want to go back to a situation where they're worrying about what happens in Ecuador or Peru or the Galapagos Islands or sending troops to this, there, and there, and everywhere, and throwing out money and treasure. And I'm sure that's right. And so the Russians have already learned that lesson. I think the Americans are hoping that the Americans will learn it.
And the British.
And the British and all of them,
because they still haven't. Because I think the Brits are still the British political class still hasn't made their peace with that yet.
No, they have not. They have absolutely not done so. Then that is entirely true. Yes. But as I said, the Russians have, and they've internalized it to a remarkable degree.
All right. Well, Alexander Mercouris, this has been an absolute treat, and I've enjoyed every second of it. And hopefully we can do this again, when we have the time and when it's really we have a particular moment in history, because this is a momentous occasion, people. This is nothing to sneer at. What happens in Russia today will reverberate, I think, through the decades. In a way that historians are going to look back on very sincerely. So, Alexander, again, as always, thank you for taking your time on a Saturday morning to do this. Hopefully we can do it again in the future. This has been the Gold, Ghosts, and Guns podcast for Saturday, January 18th, 2020. I hope you all enjoyed it. Take care and keep your stick on the ice.